At my lowest point, Simon married me. Everyone said he married me out of spite for my sister. But after he died in a car accident, he left all his inheritance to me, along with a voice recorder. When I played it, I heard his hoarse, low voice. He said, "Amy, can you like me a little too?" After many years, I finally glimpsed the vast and magnificent love he hid beneath his icy exterior. When I opened my eyes again, I was reborn. My adoptive mother was holding my hand, saying, "Amy, would you go to jail in place of your sister?" Chapter 1. Before I turned 16, I was the pampered eldest daughter of the Smith family. My parents doted on me, my brother adored me, and I lived a carefree life. But then Betty came to us with a DNA test, and I found out that the nurse had switched the babies at birth. She was the real daughter, and I was just an imposter. I wanted to leave. But my biological parents had already passed away, and Mother Song couldn't bear to see me become an orphan. So she officially adopted me. My adoptive parents treated me very well, my brother didn't neglect me, and Betty never made things difficult for me. I was grateful. But later, Betty had a dispute backstage with a fellow actor, and in the argument, the person fell down the stairs and became a vegetable. There were no cameras at the time. But someone had to take responsibility. And I happened to be there, witnessing everything. With tears in her eyes, my adoptive mother came to me, begging me to take the blame for Betty. Betty knelt before me, kowtowing, slapping herself, saying she was sorry. The whole family was crying their hearts out. So I nodded. I took the blame for her, went to prison, and suffered greatly. Initially, the Smith family still visited me, either in guilt or in apology, shedding tears. But slowly, no one came anymore. Once, the prison organized an activity, and the warden asked us about our plans after release. I thought for a long time before writing seriously. After release, I want to see Mom and Dad. A fellow inmate saw this and laughed at how simple my wish was. Of course your parents will come to pick you up, how could they not? I smiled and didn't argue. But when I was finally released, no one came. Only Mr. Smith's assistant took me to the airport and gave me a large sum of money. He didn't say anything. But I understood everything. Mom and Dad didn't want me anymore. The Smith family abandoned me. Chapter 2. I didn't take the money. It wasn't about pride. I just didn't want to owe the Smith family anything anymore. The Smith family raised me for over 20 years, and I served 5 years in prison for their daughter. We were even. I rented an apartment, worked tirelessly, and finally found a job that didn't mind my criminal record. But after just half a month, I was fired. After many questions, the manager finally stammered and said, "You offended someone you shouldn't have." I was stunned and couldn't say anything. Someone I shouldn't have offended. Who else could it be but the Smith family? That day, I walked onto the street holding my bag, light rain falling gently, the cool droplets landing on my face and body with the wind. Passing the central square, I saw Betty's live broadcast on the big screen. I stopped and looked up. On the award stage, she was stunning, radiating her beauty. The camera panned, and I saw Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith looking at her with tearful eyes. It was as if they were looking at a priceless treasure, their eyes full of love. I don't know why, but I suddenly thought of my first prison visit. My adoptive mother looked at my rapidly thinning body, promising with tears, "Amy, when you get out of prison, Mom will take care of you for the rest of your life. Mom loves you." But 2 years ago, the last time I saw her, her expression held only a faint guilt. She said, "Amy, Betty is getting engaged to Simon. She likes him very much. When you get out of prison, can you leave here to avoid Johnson family discovering the past?" Simon. The heir of the Johnson family. There was a TV in prison, and I occasionally heard about Betty and Simon's deep love. They said Simon was a famous playboy but changed for Betty. He stepped into the entertainment industry he despised for her, paved the way for her, and provided her with connections and resources. He even presented awards to her personally. I sometimes envied Betty. She had parents' love, a boyfriend's affection, and in her 20s, she had both a successful career and love. Unlike me. No parents, no career, no lover. And no one to love me. Chapter 3. Marrying Simon was unexpected. After being fired, I returned to my hometown and worked as a waitress in a restaurant. It was busy. I didn't know how he found out, but when he found me, I was serving beer to a customer. The man drank too much and got handsy. I frowned and slapped him, and he kicked me to the ground in a rage. Beer bottles and food spilled all over me. It burned badly. The man, still not satisfied, cursed and tried to hit me, but suddenly stopped. I looked up and met Simon's starry eyes. He smiled lazily, not entirely sincerely. "Amy, you're really here." I stood up, brushed off the food crumbs, nodded, and tried to walk past him. But after just a few steps, I heard his voice behind me. "Seeing you in such a sorry state, do you want to marry me?" I turned around in shock to look at him. "Have you finally gone crazy?" "I'm serious." Simon glanced at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, but his words were earnest. "To be honest, I got dumped by your sister, and I'm not in a good mood. And seeing you forced into such a situation by the Smith family, we can barely call ourselves the Victims Alliance." The street lamp flickered and dimmed, finally giving out. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I heard him chuckle. The tip of his cigarette glowed faintly red. "Anyway, you have nothing left now. If you marry me, you won't lose anything. What are you afraid of?" I thought for a moment. I didn't say anything. He quietly waited for me. Until a cold wind blew, and I shivered instinctively. Simon took off his custom-made coat and draped it over my shoulders. In an instant, his faint tobacco scent filled my nostrils. I said, "Okay." Chapter 4. When the news of our marriage spread, everyone was shocked. They all said Simon married me just to spite Betty. At the wedding, when Simon said "I do," I noticed Betty crying and leaving the venue in tears. I glanced at Simon, but he just smiled, not even looking at her. As if he had never loved her, as if he really didn't care. After the wedding, Simon treated me very well. He arranged a secretary job for me, so we were always together. I asked him why, and he just gave a playful smile. "I don't feel safe leaving such a beautiful woman at home. What if a thief steals you away and I lose my purity? That would be a big loss." I laughed at his unseriousness and didn't argue with him. In those years in prison, I suffered a lot, and my body couldn't take any more hardship. A common cold or cough for others would make me seriously ill. Simon invited many renowned doctors to treat me, and I gradually got better. He held my hand by the sickbed, seriously and devoutly saying, "Amy, I bought you. Your life is mine. You can't die before me." Childish words. But seeing the faint bitterness in his eyes, I eventually nodded. I didn't understand why he was sad. But I had long learned not to ask, not to disturb. Okay. Grow old together. But in the end, the one who didn't keep the promise wasn't me. It was Simon. Chapter 5. Mrs. Johnson. Mr. Johnson passed away at 3 o'clock yesterday morning due to a major car accident. He couldn't be saved. Please accept our condolences. When I pushed open the morgue door, Simon's parents were already crying uncontrollably. I looked at Simon's pale face and thought silently. Heaven favored him, giving him an unparalleled family background, looks, and ability. But why did it only grant him 34 years? Such a pity. Such a pity. I handled Simon's funeral personally. For 5 years after our marriage, many people still didn't believe in our marriage. Betty especially hated me out of love, always waiting to see me make a fool of myself. But no one expected Simon to leave all his assets and shares to me. Simon's parents had no objections. But when they left, their backs were hunched, no longer as spirited as before. A week later, Simon's lawyer brought me the inheritance transfer documents. Before leaving, he handed me a recorder. This was Mr. Johnson's belonging. It's been restored, and I think you might need it. Chapter 6. Amy. In the recorder, Simon's voice was clear and cool, mixed with a bit of static, making it sound hoarse. "I married you not to spite Betty. I married you because I like you." I was stunned for a moment, but my heart remained calm. As if I had already expected it. Simon chuckled softly, "Maybe you've forgotten. We've met before. Back then, you were the school's unattainable flower, but also incredibly smart, a teacher's favorite. My mentor often mentioned you. Every time he talked to your teacher, he would come back and angrily say to me, "Simon, I hate you now. Stay away from me." He mimicked his mentor's tone, making him sound particularly cute. I couldn't help but laugh softly. But the next moment, I slowly stopped. Simon continued, "At that time, I hated you, but I couldn't help but focus on you. Maybe I'm a bit of a masochist, haha. But later, you went to prison for so-called intentional injury. I didn't believe it. I had to find out the truth, but unfortunately, the Smith family cleaned up all the clues. So, I targeted Betty. It turned out, the much-talked-about love story between Simon and Betty was just an excuse for him to uncover the truth about my imprisonment. But Simon didn't expect Betty to keep her mouth shut so tightly. Yet, he eventually found some clues. I suddenly remembered that before our wedding, one day Simon excitedly asked me, "Amy, do you want revenge?" "No." I shook my head. "We're even." After so many years, I finally understood that he probably found out the truth that day. He uncovered the truth for me. And then hid it from me. It turned out, it was all because of me. My emotions were trembling violently, my whole body couldn't stop shaking, and tears fell one by one. Chapter 7. But to be fair, my acting must be top-notch to fool everyone, including you. Do you know how cute your expression and eyes were when I asked you to marry me? Never mind, I've said too much. I actually always wanted to ask you. Simon coughed. He, always proud and aloof, now sounded shy like a young boy. "Amy, could you also like me a little? In this life, I might not hear it. But in the next life, when I come to find you, you can tell me then." Amid the screeching brakes and the crowd's noisy screams, I clearly heard his last words. He said, "Amy, I really, 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 like you." The end of his voice even carried a hint of a smile. The long-repressed emotions suddenly collapsed at that moment. In the empty living room, the lilies Simon brought home a few days ago were still on the table. I always liked lilies. So he brought them to me like a treasure. "Amy, do they smell good?" I picked them out one by one. "Amy, from now on, I'll be in charge of the flowers at home." At that time, the gentle smile in his eyes was like soft starlight. How could I say no? But the one who made the promise lied. He left first. And took away the last bit of vitality from the lilies. The warm sunlight shone on my shoulders through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I reached out to touch it but only felt coldness. To this day, I finally glimpsed the magnificent and hidden love that Simon buried beneath the ice. But, it seems too late. Chapter 8. Attorney Mike met Mrs. Johnson again a week later. He came to collect the inheritance transfer documents. He had worked with Simon for many years and had met Mrs. Johnson many times. In his impression, Mrs. Johnson was always dignified, always wearing a gentle smile, like a jade Buddha on a pedestal, observing the world's turmoil coldly. Neither happy nor angry, unmoved. Even when she heard the news of Simon's death, she just froze for a moment, not even her eyes turned red. Simon treated her so well. Yet, he couldn't get a single tear from her. Attorney Mike had once felt it was not worth it for Simon. But this time, as he entered the living room, Attorney Mike saw Mrs. Johnson holding a few bundles of withered lilies, her face paler than falling snow. When she saw him, she didn't even put on a courteous smile but stated coldly, "Attorney Mike, donate his property to the orphanage." "I don't want it." There was no room for negotiation. As he was about to leave, Attorney Mike couldn't help but turn back and ask, "Madam, did you ever like Mr. Johnson?" Mrs. Johnson just smiled but did not answer. Many years later, Mrs. Johnson had become a philanthropist highly reported by the media, sponsoring countless orphans. When he saw her again, it was by her sickbed. She was only 45 but had a head full of white hair. At that time, she was looking out the window, as if seeing someone, with a few traces of girlish shyness on her face. She said, "I liked him. I always did." Chapter 9. Amy, please save your sister. She's still so young, how can she go to jail? Sister, I really know I was wrong. I didn't mean it. I don't want to go to jail. I'm a big star. If I go to jail, my life will be ruined. When I woke up from the darkness, the first thing I heard was the sound of chaotic cries. My head hurt badly. I slowly opened my eyes and saw everything in front of me. Betty was kneeling on the ground, crying so hard she was lying on the floor. Mr. Smith was holding her in pain, comforting her. And Mrs. Smith was clutching my hand tightly, her eyes and face full of tears, speaking with a bit of choking, but very seriously. "Amy, can you go to jail for your sister?" I looked at her silently, as if encouraging her. Mrs. Smith gritted her teeth and said, "Amy, there were no surveillance cameras at the scene, only you and Betty were there. The paparazzi only took a picture of a back view, unrecognizable. As long as you admit it was you who accidentally pushed Grace, the police won't find out anything. Don't worry. Once you go to prison, I will make sure everything is taken care of so you won't suffer. After you are released, the Smith family will support you for the rest of your life." She said the same thing in my previous life. But the guarantee period was only a year. When the promise expired, I was kicked out of my single cell, and because of my looks, I suffered abuse and revenge from some people. Beatings, insults, even poisoning. It was unbearable. But no one saw me. Until I was released on medical parole due to nitrite poisoning from the food, Mrs. Smith came to my hospital bed. That day, she looked down at me, her expression faintly impatient. "After all, it's prison, not a vacation resort. Suffering a bit is inevitable. Amy, don't be so delicate. Betty is going abroad for a business trip. I'm worried and probably won't have time to visit you anymore." After that, I never saw her again. Looking at Mrs. Smith's tear-streaked face now, I believe her words at this moment are all sincere. But sincerity is fickle. Her guilt and remorse for me will eventually turn into deeper fear with time. I gently released Mrs. Smith's hand and said, "No." Mrs. Smith was stunned, probably not expecting obedient me to refuse her. But I spoke again, seriously and firmly. "Mom, I thank you for raising me for 20 years, but I don't want to ruin my life for this. Call me selfish or ungrateful, but I won't take the blame for her. I was reborn not to repeat the same mistakes. In the previous life, Simon saved me. In this life, I will save myself." Then walked to Simon's side, clean and dignified. Chapter 10. My refusal enraged Mr. Smith. He scolded me for being ungrateful, enjoying the benefits of the Smith family for so many years but unwilling to give anything in return. Mrs. Smith and Betty cried their hearts out. But seeing that I was unmoved, they feared I would escape. So, they locked me in the room. Only my brother Ted remained silent from beginning to end. Just like in the previous life. Mrs. Smith took away my phone, not knowing I had a spare one. I turned on the phone. Yesterday's news about Grace's serious injury leading to a vegetative state was trending. There were few clues. Only a paparazzi had taken a blurry back view photo. And a sentence: Betty and her sister had been alone with Grace for a while. The police were probably on their way. I scrolled through the spare phone and instinctively dialed a familiar number. I froze for a moment, but eventually didn't make the call. Somehow, I felt scared. Afraid that the person on the other end was not the one I knew, even more afraid that once I woke up, I'd never see him again. In the previous life, after Simon died, I regularly paid his phone bill. In the dead of night, I sent him messages. Sometimes daily life, sometimes complaints. I would always get a reply. "Amy, I'm here." It was his auto-reply. He had said it before he died. You say, how could he be so hateful? So hateful that he grasped my heart, making me unable to forget him for 10, 20, 30 years. I got up, drew back the curtains, and the warm sun shone through the window onto me, bringing a hint of chill. I saw the police outside the door. And Mr. Smith's concealed glance. My hands trembled, but I finally sent a message. "Simon, will you come to save me?" Chapter 11. Mrs. Smith wanted to stop me from coming forward, thereby solidifying my guilt. But I pounded on the door. Faced with the police's inquiries, I ignored Mrs. Smith's pleading gaze and answered one by one. In the previous life, the case was quickly closed because I admitted the crime and even erased my alibi. But in this life, I won't be that foolish. The past 20 years of kindness had long worn out in the previous life. Not hating was my limit. Compared to my calmness, Betty's panic was more apparent. Right and wrong. It was clear to everyone. When Betty was taken away, Mrs. Smith screamed hysterically, and Mr. Smith, his face dark, occasionally glanced at me as if I were a mortal enemy, wishing to tear me apart. The two people followed Betty and left. I quietly watched, not saying a word. At this moment, Ted walked up to me and said in a deep voice, "The Smith family can no longer accommodate you, Amy. You should leave here." I looked up at him, my gaze pausing for a second on his red-rimmed eyes. "You don't blame me?" Ted was stunned for a moment. He didn't answer directly but looked distantly in the direction of the police car. His voice was as light as the wind. "Amy, you are my sister too. He said the same thing in my previous life. He advised me not to take the blame." I asked him why, and he looked down at me, his gaze gentle and compassionate like wind and rain. "You are my sister too." But I had failed his advice. This time, I decided to listen to him. Mrs. Smith and Mr. Smith probably hated me to the core now, and staying here would only bring more trouble. I said earnestly, "Brother, take care of yourself." Ted curved his lips slightly, his voice husky. "Amy, live your own life well." I packed my luggage and left the Smith family. Looking forward. The wind blew, stirring up a pile of fallen leaves. At this moment, the sunlight fell on me, warm and cozy. Just then, a figure suddenly rushed to me, speaking in a panicked tone. "Amy, I'm here. Are you okay?" Chapter 12. I was stunned for a moment. I looked up. The man was wearing a black shirt, his body tall and slender, his eyes deep, the whole person bathed in the morning sun, seemingly standing in the light. His handsome face looked lazy and indifferent. But at this moment, his face was slightly pale, and he nervously examined me. Seeing that I was unharmed, he relaxed, his gaze pausing on my suitcase for 2 seconds. He spoke again, somewhat hesitantly. "Amy, did you run away from home?" It was Simon. To be precise, a much younger Simon. Memories of the past flashed quickly through my mind. Him looking at me gently, yawning lazily, holding my hand as we walked into marriage, finally fixed on the evening we first met. He looked lazy, but he was secretly clenching his hand. He asked me, "Amy, will you marry me?" At this moment, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. Until he widened his eyes in panic and exclaimed, "Amy, why are you crying? Who bullied you?" I was crying. Why was I crying? Seeing him again. I should be happy. But the emotions accumulated from the past life all turned into tears, flowing from my heart. The tears wouldn't stop. I cried. Simon quietly stayed with me. After a long while, he hugged me, his voice low, with a hint of helpless indulgence, as if coaxing a beloved child. "Amy, don't cry. Who bullied you? I'll avenge you, okay?" "No." I clutched his sleeve tightly, shaking my head. "No revenge. In this life, I just want to be with you. Nothing else." Chapter 13. I followed Simon back to his apartment. Cold and quiet. His style. In my previous life, after Simon passed away, I stayed here for a long time. As a form of remembrance. Or maybe reminiscing. I couldn't tell. I was already familiar with the layout here. But I didn't notice that as I skillfully walked to the deepest part, turned a corner, pushed the door, and entered the bathroom, Simon's gaze darkened for a moment. Looking at the red and swollen eyes of myself in the mirror, I sighed softly. I felt a bit embarrassed. I was determined to face Simon with dignity. But every time we met, I was always so embarrassed. But it didn't matter. Simon loved me so much. He wouldn't despise me. Absolutely not. This is the most certain thing in my life. When I walked out of the bathroom, Simon was leaning against the door, waiting for me. He asked me, "Why were you crying?" I calmly recounted everything that had just happened. Between him and me, there was nothing to hide. After listening, Simon was stunned. "So, the Smith family wanted you to take the blame?" I nodded. But I refused. "This matter won't end so easily. Grace is seriously injured and unconscious, and there is no substantial evidence. We can only wait for her to wake up to clarify the blame. Even if Betty is currently considered a major suspect by the police, your suspicion is not entirely ruled out either." The more he spoke, the darker his expression became. I suddenly interrupted him. "Simon, I'm a bit hungry." He paused, his gaze falling on me. Seeing my clear eyes without a hint of tension, he sighed helplessly. "I'll go cook." I nodded. In my previous life, I had severe stomach problems, so Simon specially learned medicinal cuisine and cooked every day. He was very good at it. I once thought he naturally had cooking skills. But now, seeing the lumped-up noodles he brought out, I suddenly realized that Simon, a young master who had always been served by others, how could he have known how to cook from the start? He learned it for me. Always for me. I picked up the chopsticks and took a bite. It was quite salty. But Simon looked at me expectantly. "Is it good?" His eyes sparkled like stars. So beautiful. Just like the man in my memory who smiled and asked if I liked him. I lowered my head, holding back the sourness, and nodded heavily. "It's delicious. And, I like it very much." Chapter 14. In the end, that bowl of noodles ended up in the trash. Because I cried, Simon thought it was because the noodles tasted bad. So he picked up the chopsticks and tasted a bite. Then, the next second, it went into the trash. He frowned, dissatisfied. "I feel like crying too. How can it taste so bad?" He was very cute. It made me laugh, dispersing the gloom between my brows. I encouraged him. "It's okay. Your cooking will definitely be delicious in the future." "Why?" I smiled. "Because, I will be your only diner in the future." The man's eyes flickered, his deep eyes looking thoughtful, with an air of mystery. He said in a deep voice, "Amy, what will you be to me in the future?" I was stunned for a moment. I looked up at him and met his confident and determined black eyes. He had figured it out. As expected. He was always this smart. Maybe. I paused for a moment before slowly saying, "Lover." Lover. People who love each other. I thought Simon might be stunned or frown and ask questions, but he relaxed, his eyes curved slightly, and his lips turned up, shedding his casual indifference and appearing very sincere. He said, "That's good. That's good." Looking at the tear mole that trembled with his smile at the corner of his eye, I suddenly wanted to taste it. When the thought came, I acted. I lifted my foot and kissed it. In his astonished gaze, I smiled brightly. "Simon, I really like you. I forgot to tell you in my previous life. This life, I'll tell you. I like you. I've always liked you." Chapter 15. Before sleeping, Simon covered me with a blanket. "If you're scared, just call me. I'll come over right away." Before leaving, he placed the amulet he wore around his neck into my palm. I knew about this. Simon was weak as a child, and Mrs. Johnson had obtained this amulet for him. To protect him as he grew up. Now, he was using it to protect my safety. I held the jade pendant, my heart racing, and my cheeks burning. It wasn't until Simon slowly walked out and closed the door. I then realized my face was a bit sore. Touching the corners of my mouth, I found I had been smiling the whole time. My heart felt full. Simon was always like this. Seemingly a playboy, never taking anything seriously, but in reality, he was the most attentive and gentle person. And that night, I couldn't sleep until midnight. A bit excited and a bit scared. I glanced at the phone next to my pillow, thinking whether Simon had gone to sleep yet. I was afraid to disturb him with a call. So I decided to send a text instead. "Are you asleep?" Just as I sent it, I thought it was unnecessary and was about to retract it. Suddenly, I heard footsteps at the door. Then, the door opened. When I opened my eyes, Simon was already standing by my bed. The moonlight poured through the window, spilling onto Simon's shoulders, softening his sharp features. He leaned down and asked softly, "Amy, what's wrong?" It had been less than a minute since I sent the text. Yet he was already here. He was truly living up to his words. He said he would come, and no matter how late, he would come. Maybe, like me, he couldn't sleep that night either. Just in case I really needed him. Thinking this, my heart twisted painfully. Both hurt and heavy. Chapter 16. I stayed at Simon's place for half a month. The most interesting thing was waiting for Simon to come home. He would busy himself in the kitchen, while I leaned against the door, quietly watching him. Occasionally giving him a hand. Under the warm yellow light, he wore his hair slicked back, revealing a handsome yet slightly youthful face, shrouded in a soft haze, exuding a gentle warmth. At this time, he hadn't yet graduated from university. Compared to the decisive CEO Johnson in my previous life, he was now a bit immature, naive. This was a time I had never participated in, never known. Occasionally, he would look up at me, his lips curling slightly. The clear love in his eyes was unmistakable. He liked me so much. At this moment, I realized, in the times I didn't know, Simon was really sincerely liking me. My heart tightened, emotions flowing through my veins, finally turning into a long sigh. Chapter 17. As Simon's cooking skills improved day by day, the Smith family finally couldn't hold back. I had thought the Smith family wouldn't just let Betty confess and go to jail. But I didn't expect them to bribe Grace's manager to accuse me as the real culprit. So shameless, so despicable. In front of the cameras, Mrs. Smith exposed Betty's and my backgrounds. She cried with tears streaming down her face. "I never thought Amy would intentionally hurt someone. She has always been such a good child, but now to avoid punishment, she even framed her own sister. Betty is my biological daughter, but she hasn't enjoyed a day of happiness. Now she has to be wrongfully accused and imprisoned. Amy really breaks my heart." Betty shrank in her arms, clumsily wiping away her tears, while letting her own tears flow down her cheeks. "Mom, don't be sad. Sister must have made a mistake in a moment of confusion. If I can atone for her, I'm willing to, as long as she can be filial to you." The mother and daughter wept pitifully in front of the media. Those who make mistakes should take responsibility. You shouldn't bear what you don't have to. Finally, Mr. Smith faced the camera and spoke righteously. "Amy, the Smith family has raised you for so many years. I hope you can come forward and atone for your mistakes." As soon as the video was released, the internet erupted in condemnation of me. Truly an ingrate, a fake daughter who enjoyed the family's fortune for so many years, but let the real daughter take the blame. Is she even human? Amy, you wicked woman. Dare to do it but not admit it, truly disgusting. Yes, the Smith family treated you so well, and you repay them like this. Purely an animal. The insults kept coming. Even my private account was exposed, and my DMs exploded every day. Even former classmates called to ask about my situation. For those who cared about me, I occasionally replied. For those who urged me to confess, I directly blocked them. Despite the Smith family's continuous scheming, as long as the police didn't summon me, I was innocent. No need to panic and fall into the trap of self-defense. Simon received the news today and hurried home. As soon as he spoke, he said, "I can help you." I smiled. "No need, I can." But halfway through the sentence, I suddenly remembered something from my past life. A fierce quarrel. Chapter 18. But speaking of fierce, it was actually just because Simon was too good to me, making many people jealous. Some spread rumors about me going to prison, and there was a lot of scolding online. But in essence, it was just that they thought I wasn't good enough for Simon. Simon wanted to help me eliminate the rumors. He wanted to attend a press conference with me and sue those who were gossiping. But I thought it wasn't necessary. I had been to prison. Although I had a clear conscience, I didn't want Simon to be involved in any controversies because of me. But this angered Simon. He coldly questioned me, asking if I considered him at all, if I saw him as my husband. But I thought ignoring it was better. I thought he was being unreasonable and incomprehensible. That day, the living room lights were off, leaving only the afterglow of the sunset. After a long silence, he sneered softly and said gently, "You live blamelessly in this world, and I won't allow anyone to point fingers at you. Amy, do you understand?" I remained silent, unwilling to reply. Before leaving, I looked back and saw his solitary figure. I regretted it a bit. I thought, why not agree with him? It was just a small matter. But I didn't expect that to be the last time I saw him. After he died, I repeatedly asked myself, why didn't I stay with him? Why didn't I tell him my feelings? Those bouquets of lilies, that meticulous care, those focused gazes, didn't I really sense his love for me? I knew it all along. But I was a jerk who took his love for granted. I was sure Simon would be with me forever, indulging in his love willfully. But I never soothed his restless heart. Until he died. I understood love. But for a love that is realized too late, the cruelest part is not being able to express it or get closer, and losing it completely. No more chances. Coming back to life is a chance given by heaven to make amends. All the reservedness, shyness, and gradual progression of love, I can't bother with, and I can't learn. I just want to be with him. I just want to, really want to, still want to. So I hugged Simon tightly and then kissed his lips. Breathing lightly between lips and teeth, I said, "All right, you helped me. Here's a reward in advance." Simon was stunned for a moment, then pushed me deeper onto the sofa. 2 hours later. I was too tired to get up. But I held Simon tightly, unwilling to let go. I looked at him, obviously too sleepy to keep my eyes open, but still unwilling to close them. I was still a bit afraid this was a dream. He leaned over and gently kissed my cheek and brow. "I'm here, Amy, sleep. I'll always be here." I responded with a hum. Unable to hold on any longer, I fell into darkness. Chapter 19. In the darkness, I woke up abruptly. I was wearing a dark cyan pajama, lying in a black and white bedroom. On the bedside table was a glass of water that had gone cold, next to white pills. I looked around, it was cold and empty, but the familiar person wasn't there. My heart suddenly ached. Memories floated in my mind, scene after scene, finally stopping at that low, hoarse voice with a hint of static, "Amy, I really, really like you." It was a dream after all. I realized. I clutched my chest tightly, my hands and feet cold, as if wrapped in a net, stripping away my breath bit by bit, tears falling one by one. "Amy, what's wrong?" Someone suddenly pushed the door open and walked up to me, looking at me in panic. Through tear-blurred eyes, I raised my hand to wipe the tears, finally seeing the man's face clearly. "Amy, it's okay, I just went out to deal with the Smith family's matter. I found the agent bribed by the Smith family and also found the cleaner who happened to pass by that day." He saw Betty push Grace. "Betty has been convicted, and the Smith family is being sued by me for false accusations. Amy, no one will ever frame you again." The man gently patted my back while explaining everything that had happened while I slept. I looked up at him. Gently leaned into his arms, listening to the clear and strong heartbeat from his chest, finally smiling. "It's okay, I just missed you." I gently told him. "Simon, have I told you? I really, really, really like you." The man chuckled and held me tightly in his arms. He said, "I like you too, Amy." Chapter 20. Two people who love each other, after many years, finally told each other their love. Mountains and seas, time and space, couldn't stop the reunion of those who love each other.
Simon's Epilogue. Chapter 1. I was reborn. After my rebirth, the first thing I did was go to the Smith family. But I found that the Smith family was still harmonious. Amy was still the coldest and smartest goddess in the entire school. She wasn't the seemingly gentle but actually heartbroken Mrs. Johnson from the previous life. Amy lacked a sense of security. Prison was too harsh, and she was envied by others. Those prisoners often tortured her deliberately at night. Even after she was released, she would wake up at the slightest noise, even while asleep. Then she wouldn't be able to sleep anymore. She would sit up all night. But even so, she could still do her job flawlessly during the day. My Amy is like fragile snow and resilient pine. She looks like a ray of light could melt her. But in reality, she is indestructible. I love her and admire her. At the school's freshman ceremony, Amy, as the student council president, gave a speech on stage. I sat in the audience, looking at her from afar. The girl wore a uniform, with a ponytail, showing her beautiful yet immature face. She freely displayed her beauty and knowledge, captivating many people not just with her looks, but also with her words. At this moment, Amy was the youthful, pure academic star he remembered. Amy stood on the podium, and the wind blew through her hair. The sunlight seemed to favor her, giving her a light golden glow. For a moment, I suddenly felt that it would be wonderful if time could stop at this moment. His Amy would never have to endure those trials and tribulations. Always remain pure. Laugh when happy, cry when sad. Not be subjected to rumors and ridicule. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Chapter 2. I already knew Betty would get into trouble, so I installed surveillance in that secluded corridor. I planned to release it, but then I received a distress message from Amy. At that moment, I knew. Amy had come back too. I wanted to know her attitude this time. I wanted to see how she would deal with the Smith family. This time she refused to take the blame. She left the Smith family. I saw her quietly dragging her luggage, walking down the deserted Sycamore Avenue. When she saw me, she smiled, making me think. The sun is so warm today. I took her home. I pretended to know nothing. After trying for a long time, I made a bowl of unappetizing noodles. Seeing her stunned, gently guiding her to discover my love for her. Seeing her heart tremble for me. I should have been delighted. But when I saw her tears, I felt a pang of heartache. Forget it. I thought. Loving her is enough for me. Whether she loves me or not, what does it matter? But in the end, she threw herself into my arms, clinging tightly to me, telling me, "Simon, I really, really, really like you." At that moment, I felt like flowers were blooming all around. I tried hard to hold back my tears and responded to my princess word by word. "I do too. Amy, I also really, really, really like you." Chapter 3. People say that those who love each other will always meet again. So I think, on the day they reunite. The sun must be warm.